Hello and welcome to this lecture, and in this lecture we are going to learn something about the grid layout. So as the name suggests, a grid layout is nothing but a layout in which elements are going to be placed in a grid-like fashion. So basically you will have elements placed in the form of rows and columns. So without wasting any time, let's take a simple example to understand how the grid layout actually works. So the first thing which we do is that we replace this thing with a grid layout. And now in the grid layout, as the grid layout is actually going to contain a number of rows and number of columns, you do need to specify the number of rows and number of columns which you have in your grid. So in order to specify that, you go inside the grid layout tag and you specify the number of columns. So you type Android, and the property which we are going to use is going to be column count. So you type column count equals, and let's say this is going to have 2 columns. And you could do the same thing with rows as well. So you type Android row count and you could set it equal to 2 as well. So now in this case we are going to have a grid with 2 rows and 2 columns. So now let's learn how to add elements to that particular grid. So in order to add elements, let's say you want to add a button, so you simply type in button, and let's basically go ahead and define some properties for this button. So this is going to be, so right now as you could see, the button has no text. So let's type in some text like, let's say button 1. And now as you could see, the button 1 is actually placed nowhere. So what we will do is that we will try to place it in the row 0 and column 0. So in order to do that, we type in Android layout row equals 0 and Android layout column is equal to 0 as well. So this is the 0th row and 0th column. Now let's go ahead and try to replace the row with the second row, and the second row is actually equal to the first row because in a grid layout the rows and columns actually start with a 0. So now if you replace the row with 1, as you could see, the row 1 and column 0 lies over here. Now what if you actually make it equal to row 1 and column 1? So it's going to be placed over here because row 1 and column 1 is here. So essentially these are your columns. So this is column 0, this is column 1, and these are your rows. So this is row 0 and this is row 1. So this is row 1 and column 1. So this actually gets placed over here. So if you want to place this button at the rightmost top corner, so in this case this is going to be column 1 and row 0. So if you type in column equals 1 and let's say row equals 0, then as you could see it's going to be placed at the top over here. So that's how a grid layout actually works. And now let's go ahead and try to build the same type of email application form which we had in the previous lecture. So for that, what we will do is that we will design a layout of, let's say, 3 rows and 2 columns. So for that, what we will do is that we will try to design a layout of 2 columns and 3 rows. So let's specify the column count as 2 and the row count as 3. So now let's go ahead and add our first element to the 0th column and 0th row. So let's specify some text view over here. So let's say this thing says email. So I'm going to type in text, and that's going to be email over here. And by default it's actually placed in that particular column, but let's say you want to define the columns and rows as well. But let's say you still want to define the columns and rows. So we type layout column equals 0 and the layout row equals 0 as well. Okay, so this thing is placed correctly. Now let's assume that you want to place something in the column number 1, row number 0. So let's go ahead and add an edit text, and that is going to be having a hint, and which is going to say enter email, and by default it's actually placed over there, but still we are going to specify the column, and the column is going to be equal to 1 and the row is going to be equal to 0. Okay, so once this thing is done, we are pretty much good to go. Now we do need to add the message field as well. So what we will do is that we will type in edit text, and that's going to be having a hint of, let's say, enter message, and it automatically gets added to the next thing over here, but you still need to specify the row and column. So that is going to be Android layout column, and that's actually going to be equal to column 0, and that's going to be equal to row 1. So we type row equals 1, and we are good to go. But let's assume that if you want to actually span this thing to 2 columns, so right now this is only accumulating a single column and you want to make it span to 2 columns. So what you could do is that you could use an additional property which is called as column span. So you could type an Android column span and specify the column span as 2. So what this will do is that it's actually going to span up 2 columns for this particular edit text. So now it's actually going to span 2 columns instead of a single one. So once this thing is done, we are basically good to go. And now let's also give it a layout gravity. So we'll type in layout gravity and we will type in equal to fill. And that's actually going to fill up the entire column over here. So once this thing is done, we are pretty much good to go. Now the only thing which you need to do is that you need to add a button over here at the bottom. So what we will do is that we will type in button, and let's say the button has text which says something like, let's say, send. And now as you could notice that the button is actually aligned to the left part, and let's say you want to align it to the center over here. So what we will do is that first we will set up the columns and rows. So for that purpose it has to be in the column number 1. So we'll type column 1, and the row is by default set to 2. So that's going to be row equals 2. Okay, so once this thing is done, the final thing which we do is that we basically try to set the button to center. So we do that using the layout gravity. So we type layout gravity and we'll set it equal to, let's say, center horizontal. So as you could see, now the button is placed to the center of the screen. Now it's not exactly center because we have placed it in the column 1 and row 2. Okay, so once this thing is done, we are pretty much good to go. Now there are a few minor things which you do need to change over here. So for example, for this particular enter message, what you need to do is that this should actually have the gravity set to top. So basically you want to display this text to the top even though it spans the entire thing. So what we will do is that we will add an additional gravity property and set it equal to top. And as you could see, now we are almost done designing the layout for our email sending application. So that's it for this lecture, and I hope you guys were able to understand how a grid layout actually works and how a grid layout can be used to design a particular layout of a particular application. So essentially in a grid layout, you are going to have a grid of rows and columns. You could specify the number of rows and number of columns over here by using the column count and row count properties. Then you could keep on adding the elements and keep on assigning them the row and column positions to place them in a particular row and column. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.